in Genesis chapter 31. I failed to actually mark where we left off at last week, so I got to looking at it and going back through the study notes and things. And I just marked at verse 25, okay? We know there's a lot of things that's going on in Jacob's life right now, and she's getting ready to depart from Haran to go back home to the promised land. And we talked about those events in quite detail last week about how he was told by the Lord that it's time to go. He did. He discussed it with his wives, which was the right thing to do. Of course, they were for it. And so Jacob decides to just pack up and go. He doesn't say anything to Laban about leaving. And he just packs up and leaves. And we know from what we can tell by the timeline on this that it seems as though that Laban and his shearers were a 3 days journey away from where Jacob had pitched camp or where Jacob was staying. So one event, though, that was real interesting that takes place before they do leave, we find that Rachel in verse 19 had taken the images that were her father's. So she had taken those idols, those teraphims. And we talked a good bit about those teraphims and what they meant, and about different thoughts on it. Also, we talked about other passages of Scripture in the Bible where you find references to these types of gods. And the Bible doesn't really tell us why she took them, but the general consensus is that she took them because of the inheritance. You know, when you go back up there and you take a look at what's said here, what her and Leah said about this thing, they felt like in prior verses they didn't have a part of their father's inheritance anyway. He had squandered it away. And so we find that as you look at this and the importance of those idols, the one that possessed the idols in the family was the one that received the inheritance. And generally that was the oldest son. So there are some thoughts there about that. We do know that she did take them. Another thought on that particular subject was that kind of like she was leaving home and knowing that she would never come back, so she was taking a keepsake with her. Well, if you was going to do that, why don't you take a keepsake and hide it under the camel saddle and didn't get into all this discussion about it being stolen and heavy property search. So it seems like it more indicates toward the fact of the family inheritance and things of that nature. And we know the dynamics that was working there. There was a lot of discussion on that. And so we find that in verse 20, Jacob, the word used there in the KJV is stolen away, but really he slipped away at night is the whole point they're trying to, or he slipped away unaware to Laban the Syrian, and so he fled with all he had, and he left. He departed and headed toward Mount Gilead. Now this Mount Gilead, we're going to find in the Bible, it's a very historical point, several things taking place there that we're not going to cover. But this particular mount is located in what today would be the northwestern part of Jordan. So it is actually on the east side of the Jordan River. So we find that this is where he's headed. And this is where Laban's going to overtake him that we're going to see. Because Laban's going to pursue after him because he didn't like the fact that he had left. And so in verse 23, he pursued after him 7 days' journey, and they overtook him in Mount Gilead. And so we find something else happening here because we talked about Laban and Laban's disposition. Laban was kind of conniving, and he would, connive things up, to do things for his own prosperity, okay? And so we find that but God come to him. And a lot of times, and we talked a little bit about this, that very often, unbeknownst to men that are of a worldly mind, very often God will use them and come to them and warn them, okay, to do this, that, or the other. They're not Christians, they're not believers, they're not followers of the Bible, but we know that God uses these people to carry out His will. And we've talked about that a good bit in times past. On a modern scale, we think about the doctors and nurses and things like that God uses these people to carry out His will of healing practices and taking care of the sick and things of that nature. We also know that God uses governments that are in existence that are of a base our heathen nature to carry out his will. And we talked about that, from the old Bible about how these old Persian kings like Nebuchadnezzar and Darius, they were used by God to carry out his will. And a lot of times, they think they're carrying out their own will, but they are not. And so it has been with Laban. He's of that particular persuasion. We find that he had changed Jacob's wages, we're going to find 10 times. The way it worked out between Rachel and Leah, having to serve for those wives, and how manipulative that Laban was in those types of things. And of course we know that we're looking at a man too that was basically stooped in idolatry because of these idols. One of the things Brother Kahn keeps bringing out, and it's a very important point that we need to remember, in spite of what we do, God's going to carry out his plan. Okay? And very often, unbeknownst to men, that's what happens. He's carrying out his plan. He uses men to carry this thing out. Now, was Laban a free moral agent? Yeah. Laban couldn't make a choice. One of the things about all this, you see the prosperity of Jacob and the things that's going on with him. And we know Laban has taken note of that. He has mentioned that, but you would think that would have had an impact on him having more belief in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But it didn't. It all boiled down to the fact that, as we're going to see here about what he even says about the possessions that Jacob has, he still feels like all that's his. You've taken what's mine. Yeah. But it wasn't. Jacob had obtained that. He had worked for that. He had worked for those wives. He had worked for those cattle. And we talked about how that worked out by the power of God, how the herds were divided. And so we find that Laban now is pursuing after him. And the Bible says in verse 25, where we'll kind of pick up, and that's a quick overview. Now I know here we probably left out a whole lot of detail in that brief overview, because there's a whole lot of action going on in this chapter with Jacob and Laban, right? There's a whole lot of things that's going on here. And if we went back and went through it, we'd probably have to go back to another 2 or 3 lessons of it. So that's just kind of a quick overview. Jeff, if you think I left anything out significant on that overview, you just chime on in, okay? Because there's a lot of things in here that we talked about. Verse 25, we find that Laban is going to overtake Jacob. He's going to come to where Jacob's location is. And when we went back and looked, we find that Laban had to travel 7 days. So that was a significant amount of distance here. So, Laban had to be pretty bound and determined that he was going to talk to Jacob face to face about him slipping out like he did. And of course, under the pretense of, I didn't get to say goodbye to my family. Well, we've already talked about Laban, how he would use certain aspects of certain things. If it was to his benefit to play it out to be good, that's how he would play it. But if it was to his benefit to play it out in another way, that's how he played it out. It was all about him obtaining, okay? And he did like men of the world do. They'll use whatever. They'll use goodness and kindness on one minute, then they'll use manipulation and all on the other. It's all about obtaining a means to him. And so we find that Laban, with his brethren, pitched a tent in the mount of Gilead. And Laban said to Jacob, "What hast thou done? That thou hast stolen away unaware to me, and carried away my daughters as captive taken with a sword. Wherefore," verse 27, "didst thou flee away secretly and steal away from me? And didst not tell me that I might have sent with thee myrrh and with songs and with tabret and with harp? And hast thou now suffered me to kiss my sons and my daughters? Thou hast done now this foolishness in doing so." So we see Laban under the pretense coming on with this deal about, I didn't get to say goodbye to my family. And we've already seen when we back up about this, by what Rachel and Leah thought about the whole thing. Verse 14, "Is there not any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not counted with him as strangers? For he hath sold us and hath quite devoured also our money." So there's a lot of friction going on here. Laban wasn't interested in that. All Laban could see was, for one, where all them cattle go, Jim? Where all them sheep go? Where all them goats go? Where all mine go? And he's going to get into that later on. He's just going to bring that out. And so we find that he's using this thought to kind of play on Jacob's emotions, okay? And this word, stolen away, is used in the King James Version. If you're looking at the English Standard Version, Laban felt like he had been tricked, okay? That he'd been manipulated out of his goods. And that's not the case, because you go back, matter of fact, Jacob made the statement, hey, you haven't suffered any hurt. When an animal of some years would pass away because or die, or if something would overtake it in the wilderness and kill it, I always replaced it. He didn't have to do that. So Jacob, as far as that part of it, he done his part. He done what the agreement was, even though up to 10 times he was manipulated into a different way that we're going to find. And so we find, Laban said, well, why did you do this? I would have sent you away with a big party. And that's kind of what they did when Rebekah was sent away. They gave a big party. But a lot of times, though, God doesn't want a big party, does he? Sometimes if you linger back doing God's will, you won't do his will. So actually what Jacob did was the right thing, just pack up and go. How many times, and I think we use this as an example, how many times have people maybe wanted to obey the gospel and they paused to ask family, only not to obey the gospel? How many times have people obeyed the gospel and then went and told family and family pulled them back? And we've experienced it. We've seen this happen. So it does happen. So really, the kingdom of God works like this. When you need to obey the gospel, you obey the gospel. You look forward, don't look back. And this is the way Jacob was. So really, in the grand scheme of things, he actually done the right thing by just going. There's no need to linger. Who knows what that might have led to? Would he give him second thought? And something else Laban's looking at. Man, I have prospered greatly under Jacob, and he had. Wait a minute. Jacob gone. Now what am I going to do? So, he had a lot of thoughts going on and a lot of investment in this thing. And we're going to find out Laban is looking at it strictly from a tangible sense, okay? But anyway, so he felt like that, he'd been tricked. He felt like things had been stolen away. He felt like Jacob doing that was not the right thing to do. And so he said, you didn't even give me a chance to kiss my sons and my daughters goodbye. Now that was foolish in your doing. And notice what Laban tells. This is what's interesting. So you can see the motive side of this coming out. Notice what it says here in verse 29. It is in the power of my hand to do you hurt. You know what we would say in modern day language? I could kill you over there. That's how he felt about it. But we talked about this, and he brings up this point here that the God of your father, so he doesn't acknowledge it as his God, he's the God of your fathers, okay? Spake unto me yesterday, saying, take thou heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. And now, though thou wouldest needs be gone, because thou so longest after thy father's house, and yet wherefore hast thou stolen my gods? Now he's bringing something else into you. He said, I had this dream, and I believe it was the God of your fathers told me, now don't do Jacob no hurt either way. Even though, in the back of Laban's mind, what did he want to do? He wanted to kill him, didn't he? Because he felt like he had taken what belonged to him. So he's seeing that this thing is not playing out in that manner. So now what does he bring into being? So maybe his motive after going after him was twofold. Once the goods and people, daughters that Jacob had slipped away with, if you will, left with. But what else is a play in here? Those teraphims, those false gods, aren't they? Now he brings that into play. He said, not only have you taken away my daughters and their sons and these cattle and all this, you stole my gods. Now, stole there in the King James Version means what it means. He had taken them something that didn't belong to him. Okay? And notice what he says here. Yet wherefore, verse 30, hast thou stolen my gods? Has stolen those pictures, those statues in verse 19. Rachel has stolen the images that were in Father's house. And we talked about those images and what they consisted of, and in some of the ruins and diggings over there, they've actually found what they thought to be some of those images. They were quite common. They were a human-type figurine thought to provide prosperity and fertility and all this kind of things. And we know it's not unusual in the Persian world, not unusual today even in that part of the country, that these different gods that these people have, there's this God of fire, God of war, God of fertility, God of prosperity, so on and so forth. And so this is what he brings into play now. Not only have you done that, but Jacob, you stole my idols. You stole my gods. Now, let's stop and think about that for just a minute. That should have told Laban something right there. That the gods that he was serving, those idols, could be picked up, hid away, and taken, and the only person that knows where they're at is the person that took them. Strange gods, isn't it? That God could be picking up and taken away. But if it could be picking up and taken away, it can be destroyed, can't it? Yeah, that should tell people something about the gods that they serve. And I'm going to tell this, but Peggy was doing a cleanup job at a house that I had went with her there in Prattville, and one of the things that she would encounter was in the foyer area there was a statue of a Buddha type image. Okay, and what these people would do every morning, they cut fresh fruit for Buddha to eat. But Buddha never eat the fruit. It was an offering to Buddha, right? So anyway, being the way I am, I wish I had to pick up me a piece of that pineapple because they look so good. Piggy, don't you eat that pineapple out there, man? Well, that thing ain't gonna eat. But that's the idea that people get, about things. Now that Buddha, he can be picked up and moved, can't he? The God of heaven can't be moved. Because we as human beings can't touch him, can we? So anyway, we find that Jacob now is bringing, Laban is now bringing this into play, that thou hast stolen my God. You've taken those images. And they were valuable to a family, okay? They had significance to a family because of the inheritance that hovered around those things. Now here again, I want to say we don't know why Rachel took them. The Bible doesn't tell us, okay? But when you look at what they were and what they meant to a family, it was a significant taking, okay? It was something that really concerned Laban about those things. And so we find in Jacob, verse 31, answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid. Okay, so Jacob, Laban's countenance had already fell against Jacob because of what's said in verse 31. Jacob's sons, they were saying some bad things about how Jacob had manipulated their father and taken things and stuff, but he hadn't. See, they were envious and jealous, and we talked about envy being a powerful tool of the devil, that they were envious of the prosperity of Jacob. And so it says that Jacob in chapter 31 and verse 2 beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And this was because of what it said in verse 1, that Laban's son said, Jacob had taken away all that was our father's, and all which was our father's, he had gotten all this glory. So that was a settlement there. Well, if you go back and read it, there was agreements made on Jacob's prosperity between him and Laban. Yeah? So Laban wasn't satisfied with just what he had. He wanted all or nothing, didn't he? Even though he had agreed to these things. He felt like it had been stolen from him, and taken from him. And now, these guys, and Jacob said, you know, he realized this about Laban. Laban was somebody to keep your eye on, you know. Probably not somebody you want to turn your back on for very long, because notice what he says here. He says, because I was afraid, for I said, thou wouldest take by force thy daughters from me. Now, you know, that means Jacob, he wasn't an idiot, was he? He had that thing figured out. So he figured, you know, it's best just to get up and go and let it be, and maybe Laban will let it be. Of course he didn't. He was after those goods, he was after Jacob, he was after those idols. You mean, you got to be pretty determined. Just think about this. You shear your sheep, which is valuable to you, and that wool has got to come off. And you drop what you do, and you take your men, and you travel a 7 days journey back then. That's significant in itself, okay? You got to be pretty determined and convinced of what you're fixing to do. He didn't go all, Laban didn't go all that far to shake hands, and this is what we're seeing. Okay? He was upset about this thing. Okay? And so we find that, and Jacob, but Jacob being the man he was, even about those idols, and we know there's nothing in idols, but notice what Jacob says about the idols in verse 32. With whomsoever thou findest thy gods, let him not live. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. For Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen me. Wow. Jacob was honorable enough in himself that said, hey, wait a minute. You know, wherever you find those gods, that person needs to be put to death. So he didn't know Rachel had taken them. You know, he had just pronounced the death sentence unbeknownst to him on Rachel. And a lot of things was going on here too in that dynamics, you know. Taking these gods, Jacob knew, well, wait a minute. Maybe this was a way we can diffuse this whole situation here. And so he just tells me, hey, whoever's taking those gods, they can be put to death. And the Bible says that he didn't know that Rachel had taken them. And so what Laban's going to do now, he's going to make a big search. He's going to search the tents. He's going to search everywhere looking for those idols. And in verse 33, Laban went unto Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the two maidservants' tents, but he found him not. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. So you would have thought, doing all that searching, he would have found them idols somewhere with him. He searched Jacob's tent, the maidservant's tent, he searched Leah's tent. Now he is in Rachel's tent. But he's not going to find them idols. It's kind of interesting, you know, we looked at Rachel. You know, she could be kind of manipulative herself about things. She was smart enough to know that, hey, I can't set these things up having things in my tent in case somebody finds them. So notice in verse 34. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them into camel's furniture and sat upon them. And Laban searched all the tent, but he found them not. Pretty sharp for putting the terrapins in the camel furniture. That would be what we would call it today, maybe a saddle. And we know they had, those camels fixed up so they didn't have them saddled up, but sometimes they would have baskets and things like that stacked around them, and all kind of ways to carry goods and things of that nature. So she knew better than to put them in her tent. So Laban, he was looking for those idols. And she's got a good excuse. Notice what she does in the very next verse. As he goes into her tent searching for them, and in verse 35, she said to her father, let it not displease my Lord that I cannot rise up before thee, for the custom of women is upon me. And he searched but found not the images. You know, she said, I'm not going to be able to adhere to a lot of what you want to do here because of the condition I'm in. So, you know, she was kind of deceptive in her own way. When you go back and you look at that and you study it real close. But you know, a lot of that was doing to kind of throw him off balance. If he thought they was in the tent, that's what he was going to search. in a way, this kind of maybe confirmed what he was thinking. That didn't distract his attention away from the camel puncher. He didn't go fool the camels, did he? So, you know, we find that all this is done. And like I said, this chapter here is just so full of events and things that went on till we could go on and on. Any of you brethren got anything that you want to add to that, or anything that I know I'm talking 50 to nothing and trying to get as much material covered in this, because I think we've been in this chapter two or three lessons. So there's a lot in here that we didn't cover. So anyway, so nothing was found. But now it's Jacob's turn to state how he feels about all this. And so we find that Jacob was wrath, and he chose to wrath. And Jacob answered and said to Laban, "What is my trespass? Really, what have I done to you? What have I done to you? What is my trespass? What's my sin? That thou hast so hotly pursued after me." See, Jacob knew that you wouldn't pursue after somebody like that for 7 days unless you was really bound and determined and thought they really had done something. So Jacob questions and says, "Now, okay, you've done all this, so what have I done? You need to come clean. You need to tell me what I've done." And notice what Jacob tells him. "Whereas thou hast searched all my stuff, what hast thou found of all thy household stuff? Set it here before my brethren and thy brethren, that we may judge betwixt us." So you searched all my stuff. Did you find anything in here that you think belongs to you? If you have, bring it out here. Let's set it to the forefront, and let's see if we can bring everybody together to identify what you think is yours. Okay, so what have I done? Jacob said in verse 38, "This 20 years have I been with thee. Thy ewes and thy she-goats have not cast their young, and the rams of thy flocks have I not eaten." Jacob said, I've taken care of your flocks just like they were my own. I took care of your goats just like they were my own. If I was hungry, I didn't go out and kill from your flock to eat. I have done what we had agreed to. Notice what he says in verse 39. I think we touched on that in the opening remarks. "That which was torn of beast, I brought not unto thee. I bear the loss of it. Of my hand didst thou require it, whether stolen by day or stolen by night." So we see the integrity of Jacob. You know, you hadn't suffered any loss in any of this. So I just don't understand what I've done. "And thus I was," in verse 40. "Thus I was in the day of drought, consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from me." And so he's saying here, you know, I have relentlessly taken care of what was yours. Relentlessly taking care of what was yours. "And thus I have been 20 years in thy house. I served thee 14 years for thy $2, and 6 years for thy cattle. And thou hast changed my wages 10 times. So Laban, what have I done? Here's what you've done. You haven't exactly been upright and understanding with what all has gone on here in all this. You haven't suffered anything. You haven't suffered any loss. You haven't suffered any hurt. You've changed my wages 10 times. And so in verse 42, notice what he says, "Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the fear of Isaac have been with me, surely thou hast sent me away now empty. God has seen my afflictions, he's seen the labor of thy hands, and he hath rebuked thee yesternight." So Jacob wrote about this. He said, God was with me. He could see the providence of God. Even though, you notice how he still words that, Jim? He kind of reverts back, even though we know Jacob's ladder's come into play. God made him at Shiloh, and he acknowledged the fact that God was in this place. The house of God was there. That's what Shiloh means. And all that. But he's still not quite to that point, is he? He's still kind of looking back with this thing. And he said, "Except the God of my father, the God of Abraham, the fear of Isaac have been with me, surely thou would have sent me away empty." He said, if it hadn't been for the providence of God, you would have sent me away with nothing. Laban was already done fell out with it because of what his sons were saying. So Jacob was well aware of what was going on here with Laban and what Laban's motive was. And he also told him, unless God hadn't rebuked you, you probably would have killed me. So he realizes there's a lot more at play. Because see what you got to remember in all this? He's a part of the lineage of the promise of Abraham. Okay. God had reminded him of that, send him back to Canaan. That's why he packed up and left. God had a bigger plan. Could Jacob see it at that time? Will he ever see it again? Here again, this is a building process. Remember, I keep bringing this up because it's very important that we understand that we don't get faith developed overnight. We're going to obey the gospel one day and be able to move those obstacles out of the way that will confront us the next day. It took Abraham 50 years. Kind of interesting. From the time he left the Ur of Chaldees, from the time he was willing to sacrifice Isaac on that altar, 50 years. That's not a working process. Do you think Abraham, if he had been told to leave the Ur of Chaldees one morning, could have got up the next morning and said, oh, by the way, sacrifice your son? You think he would have been able to do that? Not in faith he would. It took time. It's a purging process. God is demonstrating over and over in these people's lives that I am Him. And so we find in this case, Jacob realizes this. And maybe I think we use kind of the standpoint of in our personal lives a lot of times. You think back when you were younger, and maybe as you've gotten older, things has happened, events has taken place in your life, and you wonder how you made it through it. How did you survive? Well, they won't answer you. God was taking care of me when I was looking out after me. It's the only way you can explain it. And this is what's going on here. God is still taking care of Jacob in spite of all this. In spite of what Jacob may do, in spite of what Rachel may do, because what is the plan? God's will. God's will. God's will. The promise has got to come in. And so he's using these people to bring about this promise. And Laban answered and said unto Jacob, here we go. Now here's Laban's response to all this. These daughters, they belong to me. See how he felt? These daughters belong to me. These children belong to me. These cattle are my cattle, and all that thou seest is mine. And what can I do this day unto thee, these my daughters, unto their children, which they have been born? So, Laban seeing he's not getting any way, he still felt like all of this belongs to him, but he can now see that this is going nowhere. What can I do? And I think he began to realize, too, the feelings of Rachel and Leah about, they felt like that their part of the inheritance or their father's goods, they were treated like strangers, they see. And so, there may be a thought here that he's beginning to realize some of the mistakes and actions that he's taken. He feels possessive, but he's beginning to realize that this is going nowhere. Okay?
Laban just confirmed exactly what Jacob was saying. It's like, I would have left it empty-handed. And he's saying, yeah, it's all mine.
Yeah.
You would have left empty-handed.
Yeah, right. He's just telling him what he already knew, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't do anything because God told me not to.
Yeah.
That's the only reason he's
not doing anything. And when you begin to study these things and you go back to the beginning, that's what we're in. I don't think we realize sometimes the dynamics that went on with all these people and all these families to get the promise here to us, There's a lot went on, didn't it? There's a lot of water that went under the bridge to get this brought about because God is dealing with people that's deemed free moral agents. And anyway, and so he sees that this is going nowhere in a hurry, right? Jacob's not going to change his mind. Jacob's not coming back. The God of his fathers has already told me, don't do no harm, I do no hurt, right? So what can we do now? We need to settle this. And so, probably Laban's thinking about, well, this is going nowhere. I got to get back and cheer my sheep. I got to turn around. I'm 7 days out, right? That means I'm 7 days behind, right? When you get 7 days behind in something, how hard is it to catch up? You don't sometimes do. So anyway, he brings up the idea. He says, listen, Jacob, verse 41. Let's make a covenant between us. Let's make a covenant between us, I and thee, and let it be for a witness between me and thee. All right, let's make a covenant. Let's sit down and get this straight. Okay? And so we find that Jacob took a stone and he set it up for a pillar. And Jacob said unto his brethren, gather stones, and they took stones and they made a heap. And they did eat there upon the heap. And this is, we talked about the way they bound contracts before. This is a contractual agreement being bound. That heap of stone to those people involved in this, that meant a whole lot. That was a reminder of what had happened. This is also going to be a boundary point between Laban and Jacob. And the thing that's going to go on there is very significant. You don't cross this, and I don't cross this, and everybody's going to be happy, but we need to remember that if nobody's around, God's still watching us, and that punishment could be netted out if we break this vow here. Okay? So anyway, we're going to get into that. Probably won't get into it this week. And Laban called it Jezashah-Dutha, but Jacob called it Gilead. Jacob called it Gilead, or Mount of Stone. Okay? Mount of Stone. Now, as we said, that's located there in the northwest portion of Jordan. Now, if you go out on the internet and look, type in Gilead, you'll find out a whole lot about it. The more modern spelling of it is Gilead, same place. And of course, some of the studies over there in archaeology in that area, they think they may have found what they think to be that pile of stone. And there's a picture of it in there. Those are some big rocks. I mean, it ain't little stuff, because they sit on top of it. It's a massive stuff. You have that big, okay? It kind of paints a picture of what's going on, in that area. But it is kind of interesting, when you go there and you take a look at it. And so we found that they eat, and Laban said, kind of interesting that Laban's bringing this up, right? I think Laban's seeing that the God of Abraham and Isaac that's dealing with Jacob has a hand in this. And he's probably thinking about that dream that he had when God came to him and told him, don't you do this man no hurt. He might not have known exactly what that was about, but he had no sense to know that, hey, this is no ordinary type dream that has come to me. Okay? And Laban said, this heap is a witness between me and thee this day. Therefore was the name of it called Gilead, and that's in the Hebrew. And Mizpah, this is interesting, we're probably not going to have time to get into that. We know that you don't see, I haven't seen much of it. I know they probably still make what's called a Mizpah coin. It's broken half, you have one half, and the person has the other half, or whatever. It has a statement on there about us being together when we're absent from each other. God is a witness betwixt me and thee, and those types of things is on it. The coin may not be exactly what you think it is. A lot of times we look at that as a great following. But what this is taken from, you need to look at the next verse at what's going on here. It's kind of a warning between Laban, Jacob, and the God of heaven. And so I'm going to start right there. I'm going to mark this at verse 48. Okay, we'll have to get ready for our worship service. But I just thought I'd leave that kind of hanging in there like that, but it's really interesting about that missing coin right now.